Okay, just good. Got it. Well, hello there. I'm Nelson Lichtenstein, and I'm here with Salem Elsway and Jason Resnikoff to discuss their new article, which have just appeared in a 2024 issue of Labor. It is entitled Whence Automation? The History and Possible Futures of a Concept. Um, and so now, I mean, I agree with the thesis, the larger thesis of this article, and I think here's the thesis sentence. I'll just read it to everyone. It says, let's see, we can recognize how the automation discourse uh, fails, which is prominent in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, fails to explain changes in the workplace over the better part of the last century, and can see more clearly what automation really has been: a discursive mechanism within the political economy of capitalism to shroud class domination, labor exploitation, and work degradation in the language of progress. Well, I mean, I agree with that. I agree with that. And it's been used, it was and is used by management as an ideological and concrete tool to counter union and worker power. And this is obviously true for the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and which the article covers in very good detail and with lots of new material involving the national security state as well as the UAW and et cetera, what was going on. And also, interestingly, this you link this to the civil rights movement. I think that was important too. So I agree with that. But let me ask you this: if such a sort of a social technical imaginary, that's one of your good phrases, was useful to capital then, can you give an example of the deployment of such an ideological construct in other eras of worker union power? You know, say after World War I, or even before that in the late 19th century, or in other countries, Europe, etc. And I mean, I was years and years ago. Charles Mayer wrote this very good book, Recasting Bourgeois Europe. He made the point that a kind of corporatism was the counter to radical unionism and socialism in the immediate World War I era in Europe. So it was a discourse of new technology present then as well. And of course, this query opens the door to was there an automation discourse in, I don't know, England or France or some other place, Germany, in the post World War II era, the period when you're really mainly talking about it. So either one of you both of you take stabs at that, or say what you want. Say whatever you want. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Salem, you want to take a shot at it first, or?
Yeah, I think like it's obviously a really important question to kind of figure out like where the origins of this thing come out of. Is it like evolutionary and emergent? And part of I think the question that becomes important is how do we even think about like what technology is? What place does it actually serve within broader capitalist discourse? And in my interpretation, the idea of like technology itself is actually kind of a new term. Mechanization and machines are like talked about a lot, much more in the 19th century, and it becomes a bigger part of the liberal discourse. Science and technology, what exactly those things are a really big part of the liberal discourse, like progress narrative, the idea of like more science, more technology. And of course, this comes into a little bit of contradiction, a little bit of tension when we start to get into pushback to industrialization, pushback to capitalist control of production. And that, in my interpretation, is really like the big issue is that, talking about Charles Mayer's corporatism and things like that, is these are ways for capitalists and bosses to try to figure out ways to contain workers' fight and struggle over trying to control production, right, at the point on the factory floor. So there's a longer history of this too, but also too, automation itself is kind of a unique type of discourse. One of the reasons why I think me and Jason are both interested in it, and why it emerges in a very particular space and time in the U.S. in the 1930s. Particularly with the NLRB, the making of the NLRB, and the kind of like corralling of a particular more radical left approach to managing work. I'll stop there and let Jason kind of build off of that.
Yeah, I agree. It's like sometimes it's easy. I have found it easy to forget, and when I first learned it, I found it very surprising that the idea of the technological society, named as such, is phenomenon from the middle of the 20th century, and that in a way you don't need an automation discourse until you have the National Labor Relations Act, until you have like where you're living in a moment before that act, before 1935, that is. In theory, an employer could, in principle, just say, "We hate unions. Unions are bad. They're bad for civilization." And one of the functions of the automation discourse is to say, when you're actually compelled to to negotiate with organized labor, you can't facially say, like, we don't believe this is a legitimate political entity. Then you need some other way out, right, of the negotiation, and then technology comes in handy. And that's what what led to, I think, the crystallization of this discourse in the 40s and the 50s. However, I will say it's not that there was like never any talk about machines beforehand. And the big example that comes to mind is from the 19 teens, maybe. It's not exactly a moment of labor strength, but in Europe, it's called Fordism, but I think the model of Ford production, right, which is here's a megalomaniacal but evidently benevolent overlord who's going to give the $5 day. But there, his model was sort of technological, but it was also, I think the technology was like sociology, right? He's going to construct some kind of weird utopian society in his factory to, he's going to create good Americans. He's going to turn immigrants into real Americans, and they're going to be well-read, and they're going to behave themselves and they're going to be virtuous. And I think this is in part the thing that Gramsci finds so impressive, right, in the 20s and the 30s. He thinks this is the
yeah.
order.
And what is it, Stefan Link, the guy?
Yeah.
I think he wrote the book on Fordism, which was really interesting. And there, the way in which Fordism is so attractive in both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and other places, and maybe less so in Great Britain. But anyway, that was a really good book. And there, kind of Ford and his publicist sort of create a kind of ideology cum technology of okay, mass production, which is sort of a technological thing, but that's going to mean we don't need finance capital. That's what made him kind of a populist. And there was a kind of, look, Ida Tarbell and lots of kind of radicals, liberals, radicals thought, oh, Fordism, that's the key to the new world. That's going to solve all the problems of scarcity. I mean, from Lenin to to Hitler in his own kind of National Socialist kind of way. So I mean, I think I do think that I wanted to see variants of the automation discourse in other moments, and the use of deployment of that kind of
well, there's one other place. It's
yeah.
one other place we could talk about, which is like you do find it among like in the post-Civil War moment, perhaps, where you have, it's in embryo, right? It's not.
Well, railroads are going to be the solution to everything. Yeah,
But there you have people like the Knights of Labor who actually don't yet have a good analysis of mechanization,
yeah.
right? Like it's kind of racist sometimes. Like it will do the work that the most degraded kind of labor can do, but like the still good white working man, not always the white,
right.
So there'll be a place for them still. They haven't made the link between mechanization and job degradation exactly. I think, and so you hear it talk, but it's not crystallized, where you don't have it as like a managerial weapon in the way you have it in the post-war period. I don't think that makes sense.
Yes. Salem, you want to say any other comment?
No, I mean, building off kind of what Jason was saying is that like that's what I think becomes really interesting about the automation discourse and what his work has been really great at, and kind of motivated me to look at the approach to how I'm studying automation is very similar in that, like, how do we understand how degradation is not necessarily a technological phenomenon, how technology is just one component of this, is that degradation is a social and a political phenomenon. That's one reason why I got so interested in looking at the UAW too, is, we can dig into a lot of, how is it that they're structuring their arrangement, particularly, in the 40s, in the 50s, when we get Rutherism, when we get workplace contractualism, that kind of like solidifies these relationships themselves when this era of high technology is kind of exploding, and when automation becomes this really important thing. And I think what's really important, I kind of point out in some of my my unpublished work, my dissertation, things like that, is that a lot of times technology obfuscates the way we think about these things. Like the term becomes this kind of mystified thing, where really when I think about automation, I think about it as capital. That's like what it is. It's new kinds of machines, new kind of processes that are being deployed in traditional capitalist social relations. So trying to explore them, it gives us kind of a really tried and true way of getting into exploring these things, is that once we demystify it, which is a lot of what me and Jason have been trying to do, you demystify and you can get a better sense of actually what's going on in terms of the power politics and the players.
Mm. Let me ask you another question, which I was struck by the well, you mentioned Ruther and others. Do you think that the left or the liberals in America, or well, let's say America, are particularly seduced by the automation discourse? I mean, many of your examples were of people who would you generally consider on the liberal side of politics, so and some laborites. I mean, I ran across just recently an article by Gabriel Coco from the 1950s, published in Dissent, which is totally enraptured with this automation discourse. I mean, there he's sort of worried about unemployment, but basically he accepts it. So is there a way that the left is particularly susceptible to this? And what I mean is, how would you differ the left from say conservatives in the way they think about it? And can you give me, and again, I mean, and you had many examples of this seduction into the automation discourse of, well, some conservatives and liberals, but can you give me examples of people who resisted it? I mean, kind of, do you have any heroes who, oh no, this is wrong and we shouldn't do it? Was there at the time, not just looking backward, can you unions or just intellectuals, et cetera? So that's sort of my combination of a bunch of thoughts and questions there. Take a stab at that.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, it is sort of disheartening how many like union officials went for it. I mean, and the thing is, I don't know, whenever I think about this and when I talk about it, and you will know this very well, Nelson, I imagine, there's a cottage industry of like beating up on Walter Reuther, saying all the things he did wrong.
Yeah.
And so it's like, no, I have my own critiques, but it's not necessarily the most interesting conversation to jump right into. And so then we find ourselves doing the same thing, oh, Walter Reuther, why didn't he know better? But I actually do think that there is one of the things that makes this so seductive is actually you could argue the ideological functions of the idea of technology itself, which is that it actually it occupies and usurps a lot of revolutionary ideology, like a lot of Marxist thinking. It can be brought into the automation discourse, which is to say that the ultimate end of history will be the abolition of human labor. The lion will lay down with the lamb, and we'll have a perfect society brought to you by the motions of capital. I mean, that sounds like the scientific Marx that most of us have read. And so, the left is, I think, supremely in danger of falling into this. And if you read the pages of Jacobin, I think you find people on both sides, but you still have quite a few accelerationists out there.
You wasn't going to use accelerationist? That's a good. What's that? That's a good word. What's
that? Yeah. It's people who want to speed up the development of industrial capital because the ultimate end of it will be basically the revolution, right? I actually think the ultimate end of it will be the end of the planet.
Well, Marx thought that, right? Marx was all in favor of it. I mean, industrial, right?
Yeah. And what's crazy is that capitalists would argue this way, actually, that they would want to talk in this way, but they have to, after the Soviet Union comes to exist, or it's one of the reasons the space race becomes a big deal, that there's the socialists can claim to be the technologically progressive entity and so I think one of the things that automation does is it tries to reclaim that for capitalism. Right? That it's not going to be the socialists who are going to produce the revolutionary ideal society. They have better living through chemistry, and we can do it.
Well, Silicon Valley, when Steve Jobs would say this will change the world, I mean, they would get up there on a stage, and this is revolution, changing the world, and yeah.
But then I want to hear something that Salem has to say about this. But this is where I feel a little conflicted, actually. The thing is, machines do increase labor productivity, or they can. So it's not crazy for someone to think like, we have these mechanisms at our command in theory, or the command of society, if not of the workers. Why don't we have the 30-hour work week? Why hasn't that happened? Shouldn't we be able to do that? And that's not a crazy question. It's just not a technological question. And so I think that's the other thing it kind of plays off of, something that's true, actually. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like, Nelson, you asked about like, maybe like specific examples of unions or leaders or intellectuals that talk about it. I think there's like one character that's kind of interesting is Harry Bridges. And he actually changes from the 50s. He was one of the more outspoken union leaders about the more negative degradation aspects of automation in the 50s. But by the 1960s, when he has the modernization and mechanization agreement, he essentially flips and there's a lot of pushback internally, right, on the docks because of this. And one of the reasons why the pushback comes in the way it does is this is where the racial question comes into play and civil rights comes into play, because essentially the actual material history of what we call automation is one of degrading labor and of course putting on the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, and then within the labor unions themselves. And then of course with the UAW and the way that they link up productivity to their wage and benefit increases, right, makes them, essentially a lieutenant to this like capitalist captain that's like driving this technological ship. And that's what becomes interesting too, is that then it gets ensconced in this broader kind of like structural environment. Once we get into the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, one of the things we talk about in the article is that the idea becomes more automation is going to solve the problem. And this is just a tried and true mechanism that just kind of keeps, I call it like, it's like actually a version of like it's technological Keynesianism. And we like live in this today is that like, we're going to get more AI, it's going to be even better. It's like, yeah, there's going to be these short-term effects, but the more that we have this technology, the more we can grow the economy. And it just has this kind of like economic growth as the solution. And the way we get that is more productivity. And the vision of the automation discourse is that to get more productivity, you have to have more and better technology and deploy these things. And again, kind of getting with what Jason was saying earlier, the left is extremely susceptible to this because like
Yeah.
we're not, people, I say we, people on the left, right? They're not anti-technology. They're not
Right.
Luddites. The
Right.
vision of Luddites. That's not how this thing works. But I think the problem is, and I think, this was addressed when you start to look at, you might know that you would probably know this better than either of us. When you read the documents, particularly in the 1950s, of something like a Nat Weinberg or a Jack Conway in the UAW,
Mhm.
they're not like they're not these kind of ignorant actors. They're very aware of like what they're doing tactically and strategically, and they're understanding like we're taking a certain kind of risk. I think the problem has been that with the advent of what we consider to be like globalization, deindustrialization, is that the left is put into a position where they have painted themselves into a corner. And it
Mhm.
just gets more difficult to solve these problems because these are institutional and structural problems. They're not individual sectoral or union issues. These are much broader issues.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, I think the bridges, and I think so the people Weinberg. Well, Weinberg, and I've just been writing about him a little bit. They did think, with we can manipulate the collective bargaining agreement in such a way that we get the benefits of this. Bridges, I thought, and his people had a kind of almost cynical view of it. Yeah, okay, we're cutting a deal here. We know what we're doing. We're going to cut this deal. Okay, it's just for our people. He sort of it's not going to have an impact on the rest of the country, but we're going to get ours. We're getting our slice.
I
A kind of
think
almost crude syndicalism.
Yep.
Uh, and,
I think
and
it's like I think it's fair to criticize Bridges, especially the A men and the B men,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
The
oh
thing.
yeah, sure, right.
But on the other hand, I think the principle that he hit on might be really smart. Which is if you like, okay, the grand bargain of labor is going to be the capital owns the capital, the owners own the machines, and the union owns the jobs, right? And
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah,
so if you want to do something to the job, buy our jobs from us, buy us out
yeah.
because stock workers that work today have a
Right.
much better deal than, I don't know, packing house workers. It's like
Right,
it's not the worst model to say like, okay, if you want to buy this from us, you have to
Well, I
actually
mean,
buy.
and the ILW did succeed. I mean, you make 160 or $80,000 a year as a regular longshoreman, and a slice of the benefits of containerization have in fact gone to the union. That's sort of one of the few unions that's really captured that. So that's absolutely the case. Yeah, I mean, just one. So do conservative? I was thinking of Newt Gingrich or someone like that. He was sort of like this uber optimist of, I mean, and we shouldn't. Do conservatives have a different? I mean, what do they do? How would you the difference? A conservative just going at this?
I guess
So, I mean, I like when I was actually researching my chapter, my dissertation, like on the Kennedy and Johnson administration's response to these things. I started looking at a lot of stuff written by Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater, it's kind of interesting if you go into like, for instance, like, Human Events, very like, well-known conservative publication. Goldwater was very pro-automation. And I think a lot of the conservative position, just broadly speaking, they were very pro-automation for obvious reasons, because of capitalism and free enterprise. That's mostly their position on it. But when you brought up Newt Gingrich, it's really interesting because like I'm working on another project that I call Atari Politics. Right. So this is like a thing of Atari Democrats that's been written a lot by really great political historians. But a lot of people don't pay attention to the Atari Republicans. And Newt Gingrich was one of these people. And Barry Goldwater was kind of like the seed of this, is that he was very much like, we should have more technology, we should have more automation. And the reason why is because if we have automation, we can get rid of the welfare state, right? Because we'll be able to provide all these goods and services for cheap, but there's going to be an abundance of economic growth. So this kind of ideology, and Gingrich is like very much on this tip. He's like a very, very similar kind of approach to this, but he has a much more kind of sophisticated language in the 80s and the 90s, right? He likes to act like a Leninist. That was like his like thing. His favorite politician is Lenin and so. But yeah, the conservative position on it is actually pretty interesting. I think actually GM is a good representation of it because GM was typically considered one of the more conservative of the big three.
Yeah.
So their manager's approach to it, I mean, the gentleman who managed the Lordstown facility right when the strike breaks out in 1972. His name's Joseph Godfrey. When you read a lot of his speeches and the documents, he looks at automation as like a military formation, like being able to instill a certain kind of efficiency in the factory. We'll be able to manage our workforce in a much more kind of like top-down hierarchical authoritarian manner, because this entire kind of like structure of technology allows us to more like efficiently organize things. So there's like this like vision of it that he's even discussed about how he has like a crew cut, right? He makes sure he has his crew cut. He wears, the tie in the shirt, nicely pressed. So there's a really interesting kind of conversation about the conservatism of GM kind of being representative.
Yeah, right. Very good. Yeah.
What I was going to say is, I mean, with much less detail, I think that, the automation discourse basically has as its most fundamental sort of concept or presumption is that basically, I would say, conservative argument, perhaps, depending on what kind of conservatives you talk about. But it's that labor doesn't contribute much, or is contributing less and less and less to society, to civilization, to the production of value. And so the thing that's wild to me is that anyone on the left would buy into it, right? That you kind of could smuggle in an argument that says labor should not have any value in theory in society, that the destruction of the proletariat, in theory, again, would be an ideal outcome, right? Rather than a dictatorship of a proletariat or a proletarian society, that we should abolish it. And so, I mean, sometimes I do feel like when one writes about this, it ends up being mostly about like leftists buying into conservative ideas, So
I mean, all the discussion in the 50s about all this leisure time. I mean, in a way, that's the abolition of work. We got all. What are we going to do with that? That's a big problem. Too much leisure, Yeah.
Exactly, but that's also a part of the conservatism. We can't. It's almost like a de Tocquevillian sort of aristocratic, concern.
Yeah.
What are these idiots going to do with their free time? Watch TV? Like this leisure is going to be a serious problem for us. They'll be fat and happy and stupid, and they won't vote right or that kind of thing.
This is very good, very good. Okay, let me give you my most devil's advocate question here. So, okay, I wrote a book about Walmart. All right, and there the ideology of management. Well, they had automation was there. I mean, Walmart was actually a very technologically advanced firm, but ideologically, Walmart, deployed I think the heirs of Elton Mayo, and was turned out to be far more pervasive and probably effective. And that's certainly true in non-union settings, which is the vast majority of American workers these days. And so that whole human resources, ideology of family, servant leadership, etc. I mean, maybe now at this particular moment in 2024 with a labor upsurge, that doesn't quite play as well as it used to, but boy, it certainly has been pervasive most of the time. So I would here's this. So yes, there is an automation discourse, but that is actually confined to certain sectors of sort of manufacturing with unions, whereas the vast majority of American workers are immersed in this managerial ideology of really which derives from Elton Mayo, not Frederick Taylor, although obviously the two get combined. So what do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Oh, sure. Well, I would say, I mean, there's a great deal of truth to that. There's no question about it. On the other hand, I would say that they're not mutually exclusive. That, you know, they can be combined, but they also work in tandem, and especially in different like retail environments where people are sort of compelled to use machines or just systems that degrade their labor. But then they're often with the upshot that they're being told that they're being liberated, actually, that they're being given an immense convenience. You would know better if that's true about Walmart in particular, but where I see it in retail, or actually white collar work as well. These are other places where, you know, you have capture of effective desire by management, whether it's, you know, it's like we're all part of a family, but, you know, what is it that you really want out of this job? What do you see yourself in 5 years? This kind of really perverse language when the answer is like, I just want money every month. That's why I'm here, among, you know, maybe some other things. But really, that you have to display a different kind of loyalty. In these environments, it becomes all the easier to say, like, well, because you love this job so much and because we're all a family, we're bringing in a new mechanism or machine to help you do your job better, which just how happens to actually degrade the job classification that you're doing. And I mean, so I can be more specific, like, well, it actually happens a lot if you work in academia, by the way. Where in particular, I do way too much of my own. It's not the same as working in Walmart at all. But I think a lot of people, these systems come in, they make you do your own HR work, right? You have to engage with these systems that are they're called automation, it's called convenience. But if you wanted to go more basic, if you go to like, you know, automated checkout counters at a supermarket or something,
That's true.
right, an example where that's definitely like a retail job. And what's really being happening is like a checkout person who used to check out one customer at a time now has to sort of oversee 5 people checking out at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And I think, and again, that's maybe to your point, like this is where Elton Mayo's philosophy at the Human Resources School and automation can intersect, which is that part of the tools of being a happy family are like automation technologies.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
but to your point, yeah, I do see what you mean, which is to say that definitely in the United States, where it's been deindustrializing, you don't see that much automation stuff. But I do think one of the reasons that current AI
Yeah.
fracas is because actually industries that were thought to be insulated from Taylorist mechanisms
Yeah.
are discovering that they in fact are vulnerable to them. And that's, I think, one of the reasons people have been so shocked with ChatGPT, for example.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think also like with the Walmart example too, I think what becomes really critical in talking about that too is that one of the things that Walmart's obviously extremely famous for is supply chain management. So the idea that the Elto, like the Mayoism itself becomes a function of actually outsourcing so much of what could have been automated in this much more traditional kind of manufacturing sense. So the Mayoism, in my opinion, would become more important because the very composition of your labor force and what they're doing looks a lot different, right? The labor force is not necessarily making the products, right? It's in charge of just like managing the actual like shopping space, the retail center, and things like that. So the interaction between management and the workers like becomes a really different kind of phenomenon when other people in, let's say, China or Vietnam are making everything, and they're the ones who are actually dealing with the automation discourse in reality versus this idea of like creating this family here at home. And of course, like, you know, with Walmart, its origins, it's kind of like Christian origins and free enterprise origins, like how much of that becomes like imbued with the Maoism, like to
Yeah.
me is a really
Yeah,
interesting question.
right. Absolutely. I mean, by the way, in China, the automation discourse takes a kind of form of kind of a nationalistic, you know, where you know making the country great and therefore let's work hard, you know, it's work hard and new technology and all of that. And you could, you know, they like Foxconn is kind of I think the phrase in China, a national champion. That's the phrase for these big companies. And I think it I don't know, maybe that's falling apart now, but that was certainly the case for a long time. Okay, well, one last kind of actually 2 more questions. Um, uh, one is, let's be practical here. We had this strike in Hollywood, and AI was discussed a great deal. Artificial intelligence was discussed. That was at first the management didn't want to deal with it, but then they sort of. So, what would you say? What would be your advice to the Screenwriters Guild in dealing with AI, or the Screen Actors Guild too? What would be your advice? How would you guys, if you were hired as consultants to these two unions in their battles coming up?
Well, Salem actually did consult, so he
Ah,
should.
okay. I want to know. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a friend of mine who is actually in the WGA. So this is not for Screen Actors, but for the Writers Guild of America.
Yeah. Right.
He sent me their contract when they were in the midst of doing some of their bargaining.
Yeah.
So they actually have, I actually just like pulled it up really quick. So I was like, it's let's see, WGA proposal number 29 on generative artificial intelligence. And I found it like interesting. I mean, one, it was one of the most kind of like direct discussions that I've ever seen in a union contract about workers controlling technology, right? In the very classical kind of like David Montgomery sense of this thing of
Yeah.
like workers control of production that I was like relatively, I don't know if impressed would be the right word, but like I was like relatively happy. I'm like they have a good sense of this idea that the actual writers doing this work, all the editors, the people doing the actual labor of writing, that they should have much more say in how these kind of technologies, how AI is being used. And for clarification, me and Jason were talking about this earlier, like artificial intelligence is it's mostly a marketing term. It's mostly hype. It really doesn't refer to like anything specifically. A lot of this is about like large language models and chatbots and things like that. So even in the contract, they're like, we know that the definition is not exactly, we don't know exactly what it is, like, but we understand kind of what we're all talking about. And they did a pretty good job of saying like essentially the studios don't have carte blanche to just use artificial intelligence whenever they want. They have to inform the individuals who have been working on this, that they inform the WGA. There's different kinds of grievance and negotiation mechanisms that are involved. The only problem that I saw with it, and I communicated this, to my contact, was one when you leave that definition so open, that can create extreme legal problems. Because if somebody has power to hive off certain parts of this thing, in the future, you can imagine that an LLM will not be considered artificial intelligence. Somebody could just say, no, this is just a program for dealing with language, right? It's not actually artificial intelligence. That's much more advanced. So there's that kind of like capacity for those things to happen. And then at the other end, what are the actual monitoring mechanisms for these things? That's really difficult. I mean, once let's say you're a screenwriter and you send off a screenplay to the studios, who knows what they're going to actually do with that, like in production, right? What kind of changes are being made? Who's involved with it? To me, there's like lots of ways of getting around it. And the good thing though is that I saw beyond the contract itself, there was an op-ed. I can't exactly remember who wrote it, but there was an op in the New York Times that talked about this very dimension of the contract. And to me, just from a kind of political propaganda perspective, getting the conversation out about workers having control over their own tools, to me, is something you rarely would ever see in the New York Times. So having people read that and being aware of how the connection between the strikes and between what these contracts look like, to me, that's a really good step in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I find interesting about it is that when I was talking to a few of the people in the WGA, one of the things they're concerned about is not that the chatbots, these large language models, are going to bodily replace them or wholly replace them, but that writers are going to become like a kind of prompt engineers, right? That and in fact, this will be very typical. It would be extremely typical the way Taylorism has worked in the past, as well as mechanization, which is that you take a craft, you break it up into its component elements, you bring in the machine to help do that, and then skilled artisans become semi-skilled machine operators, right? And then so what you use the large language model to do is like, this particular software is good at writing dialogue, and this one's good at coming up with plot lines, and then this one goes up with the subplots, and then need to be fixed up and polished, and the writer's room becomes a kind of writing assembly line, and you have to deal with it in this way. And so it's the answer to this. I mean, this is maybe kind of the argument that Salem and I have been making, is that because automation, I would argue AI is a kind of part of the automation discourse, because the word is so vague, the concept is so vague, that actually it's still industrial production. So the tools that were invented by labor to solve this problem 100 years ago still apply. And, it's like, workers control, good contracts, these kinds of things. However, this is also kind of a scary idea, because I wanted to throw this to you, Nelson. I don't mean to ask you a question, but I can't think of too many examples of unions successfully negotiating to control the means of production, in American history. And for that matter, the sort of the tendency of industrialization has been labor degradation. There aren't too many examples where new machines are brought in and workers do a great job of protecting their crafts. And so, I mean, I don't think the reason to be worried is not new, but old. It's like the same thing again, and that's been extremely effective of management breaking up good work, turning good jobs into bad jobs. And so again, the fact that it's old doesn't necessarily make this a good situation. That's the impression I
Right.
get.
Yeah. I mean, although there are some craft unions where essentially they still like construction. Okay, you do this job any way you want, but here are but we're only going to give you X amount of money, and you have to do it in this amount of time. So it's sort of you have control, but then you're constrained, and you sort of exploitation takes place. I think that's something and that was part of the quality circles and the team production. Sort of okay, you're in charge of it, but here's your constraints, and then you self-exploit. But that's okay. Yeah. Well, you guys know a lot about AI in Hollywood. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay. My last question is just to end this is tell me what you both of you are up to in terms of your current project, next project, where you're going, not necessarily with this, but what are you doing in your scholarly endeavors here? So either one, both of you. I like the viewership would like to know.
Yeah.
Debate.
So I'm currently in the process of doing the dissertation and manuscript book. So tentatively, it's going to be called Accumulation Machines, A History of the Industrial Robot in America. And
Great.
so it'll be the first scholarly history of the industrial robot, and obviously engages a lot with automation. And then turning essentially my discussion about Lordstown and me and Jason's article, doing that into its own article as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, go ahead. Jason, yeah.
Yeah, right now I find myself going back in time rather than forward. Although people keep asking me about AI, which I find, which I have to know about, but I find myself moving into the 19th century, which is why I mentioned it earlier, I suppose. And my next project is tentatively titled "The Slave is the Model," which is to say that one of the models, especially in American industrialization, was the idea of slave labor, and that when mechanization was taking place, engineers were actually thinking about enslaved people doing this kind of work.
Mm.
It's one of the reasons that it ended up being so degrading. And so I'm looking at places where machines and enslaved people were thought to be synonymous or actually did become interchangeable. That's mostly in the 19th
Oh,
century.
that's very interesting. Very good. Very good. Well, this has been great, and I hope the labor's this is a good thing that labor does, and I enjoy this very much, and look forward to seeing you're both all over the world, but I look forward to seeing you guys at some conference. So good. Thank you very much, and we will end this now. Okay.
Thanks, Nelson.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Really great to talk to you guys. A lot of